So another way to look into our experience is really to start to look at the sense of relationship that seems to remain hidden underneath the surface of our initial interpretations of experience or assumptions of experience. We could basically call that a sense of relativity in our experience or a temporal sense of evaluation. When we start to be presented with an apparent fork in the road, so to speak, when we are given two choices that seem to be opposing choices, we don't often see that there is something underneath the surface there that is extremely crucial toward realizing what seems to be going on. It does seem important to find our point A in our experience, where our patterns begin to arise, and those pieces that seem to continuously bring us into some sense of consistency. I know that's probably a mouthful, so let's see if we can break that down a little more simply. If we were, say, presented with two opposing experiences or two choices, a proverbial fork in the road, what happens is we start to essentially defer to the mind there, and we start evaluating information and coming to a decision. What we are essentially doing is displacing our sense of intuition, which is a natural movement, and we're essentially moving into a place of resistance. We could call that hesitation, ultimately. Yet what it really comes down to is a distrust of something. We are somehow looking for the best possible outcome. We're somehow looking for a gain instead of a loss. And really what we're doing there is we're playing within the framework that there exists gain and there exists loss. Ultimately, the pointing here is to remind you that this is all moot, that there is no increase, there is no decrease, nothing could ever actually be gained, nothing could ever actually be lost. And we even know this scientifically, without getting too heavily into the theory of in thermodynamics. The way that entropy basically works is that no energy is created nor is it destroyed. And in a system itself, it can seem to have these oscillations, we could say, or a flow of energy from a density to less of a density. Yet in thermodynamics, basically the way they describe it is something with low entropy has a high density of energy, and that over time, this perception of time, it moves into a lower density of energy, and that is called high entropy. We know that all of the energy from the sun, when it hits the earth, all 100% of the energy that reaches the earth is also released back into space. And that seems really counterintuitive to our experiences here. Yet, all of the life on this planet, even though if it is giving a sense of time delay, is essentially moving the energy of low entropy from the sun into a higher form of entropy before it's being released into space. This, I know, probably feels really heady, considering a lot of what we do on the path, yet ultimately what it's demonstrating to us on a macro scale is that there is really no collection of energy or density of energy that can be hoarded, essentially. In other words, we can't hoard experiences, nor could we have any sort of gain versus a loss. This all is essentially moot, and that's really the point. So when we are presented with this apparent fork in the road, and it seems like I could either do the thing or not do the thing, and we move into some place of analysis, or we move into some place of finding the most optimized approach, we're playing a trick on ourselves. We're essentially playing a trick of delay. And all we really need to do in that experience, if we find ourselves in a state of hesitation or a this or that experience, which is very Shakespearean, the Hamlet to be or not to be speech, we are essentially putting the experience in a perceived sense of delay. It's already moot. There's already an intuitive movement that's guiding us into what a natural movement is, and we're essentially attempting to resist that through this course of hesitation. And so what we really want to start to look at is the sense of relationship, which is this subject-to-object relationship. in that experience, and then we will begin to find a closer sense of what initial experience or arising expression seems to be. It's not really about what we do or don't do. We could basically consider those experiences clickbait. We actually cannot make a wrong move here. There is no better or worse choice. That has to be within some sort of frame of delusion or belief. Instead, we can look a little bit more closely into the perceived sense of subject here, and we can look at what the relationship is with the consideration of doing something or not doing something. And in that, what we will find is a density of experience that we could just call a sensation. When we're faced with a seemingly impossible choice, or something that's a weighing of the two things, a sense of hesitation, there will be a corresponding sensation at the very base of that, and that is where we start to discover a relationship. And so this video, albeit somewhat short, is just an encouragement for all of you to first look into these experiences that show up, look in the places that you are attempting to optimize your experience or the things that arise in your life, and then look a little bit more closely to the relationship with those experiences, and you will begin to find what lies under the surface, essentially the very outset of experience and expression. And then you can start to look at what wants to manage sensation, because ultimately this comes down to a perceived sensation-thought interface like this. And that perception of sensation and thought interfacing is actually not what's happening. And you will begin to see that as you look a little bit closer. Sensation is arising, thought is reflecting in that particular buffering of as the arising of sensation. And then the reflection of that sensation is what essentially gives us our sense of time. It's also what gives us our sense of space, and it also seems to impart a sense of agency. And so in the experience of relationship, what we begin to find is something sensational that's either being resisted or avoided or otherwise hesitated around. And that right there is essentially the outset of all identity, of all that wants to reflect, adjust, modify experience. The most direct path here, to make this really clear, is to move so directly into the initial arising of experience, which will be sensation, which will likely take a tone of something like overwhelm or impossibility. The more we begin to reconcile in such a way and move attention with whatever this agency of attention seems to be, let that be your primary sense of agency altogether, the more thoroughly we do this, and the more regularly we do this in a broad stroke of reiterating experiences, we will begin to find a particular thread or a signal or a theme that remains here all the time, that never seems to go anywhere, that there's not even a perceived gap with, and that is just the initial sense of arising. In that initial sense of arising, we essentially become so close to the very outset of that our perception of time begins to collapse, our perception of space begins to collapse, therefore our perception of a self begins to collapse. It's in that initial arising sensation. It is a powerful compass. It is a powerful gateway to this. Move attention thoroughly into sensation, and you may be meeting attention that is already there. And then it becomes impossible to really even have a sense of agency in that. To move attention to where attention already is attention ever moved at all? It becomes very viscerally this way. And we will begin to see that it comes down to relationship. Relationship starts to impart a sense of reaction. It starts to impart a sense of these dominoes that tend to fall, reactions to reactions, a fear to fear, a resistance to resistance, an avoidance to avoidance, and a hesitation to hesitation. We find ourselves really starting to see this hall of mirrors, so to speak. And so we really don't need to make a decision. We really don't need to analyze the most optimal path, because all of this is essentially moot. And we find that in the sensational experience itself. The details that arise in thought are just temporal and spontaneous. and they don't actually have a theme, but they impart an assumption that there's a theme or a consistency or a continuity here. And that part becomes really interesting. So in the consideration of relationship with all experience, we move thoroughly into what seems to be the arising of that experience. And then we start to see this manager come in and attempt to either soothe, modify, or otherwise manipulate experience. And instead of participating in those particular mechanisms, we just remain thoroughly in stillness, in concert with sensation, and in a state of presence, we could say, which really isn't a state, but in the consideration of this, it can be best formulated or framed that particular way. So I know this has been quite a mouthful and there's a lot here, yet what I'm really encouraging you to do is look at your relationship with arising phenomena altogether. Look at the relationship with the consideration of doing something and not doing something. And in that, you will begin to see that there is a felt sense that seems to remain consistent there. And so if we begin to move more thoroughly into that felt sense, we begin to find very primary mechanisms of either hesitation, resistance, or avoidance. And then from there, we begin to see how the manager is functioning. So this is really that Wizard of Oz effect. When we are at the base of our experience, closer, closer, more and more, deeper, deeper, and we begin to look outward at these satellites of thought and these satellites that seem to contain detail, they become absolutely transparent. For a lot of us, it is our initial experience of seeing the emptiness that is formed. We see the emptiness of these mechanisms. We see the moot points that they're essentially attempting to make, that they really don't hold any water. We are essentially pulling back the curtain, and we're seeing that munchkin working the levers and pulleys, the one that is actually controlling the big green head that we thought was the Wizard of Oz. And in that particular insight, just that particular thing that is being seen in that experience, we start to have a curiosity that arises that basically guides us like an intuition into a profound sense of immediacy. And that's really what this is all about. So you could look at it just simply this way. All things that arise, if there is a sense of a subject experiencing that experience, then the relationship is imparted through a sensation, a sense, something that's being felt. So we move more thoroughly into the felt experience, and we look outward at these surrounding fragments of what is whole or what is empty, and we begin to see what they are doing and how they are functioning, and that right there is essentially the honing and the tuning of awareness. And this can show up in a variety of ways, yet as a primary point of experience, you have this available to you right here, right now, while listening to this video. You can feel it. You can notice these thoughts that are attempting to essentially guide, manipulate, or otherwise change experience. And then we have a secondary approach, something that basically says I can participate in those thoughts, or I can just remain with this as it is, and we will find a resounding sensation there, one that is total, one that is complete, one that may feel overwhelming, and that right there is what we could just call truest nature. Not only do I encourage you to come into contact with that, but I encourage you to realize that that is what you are, and that is what is everything. And you will begin to see that more clearly as you look into this sense of relationship. And in the meantime, as always, questions, comments are welcome, and I appreciate your eyes and ears, and as always, I appreciate you being here.